Welcome to Reddit After Hours. This is r/Prorevenge, where OP discovers that his HOA president has laundered more than $50,000. Our next post comes from BB Keys, titled The HOA President's Long Goodbye. When I moved into my suburban neighborhood, I expected peace and quiet. Instead, I walked into a petty dictatorship run by our HOA president, Todd. Todd was the worst kind of leader, the kind who loved power but hated accountability. He enforced ridiculous rules like fining people $200 for leaving their trash cans out 1 minute past 9 a.m., but blatantly ignored the rules when it suited him. His own yard was a mess of unpermitted structures, and his fence was taller than allowed by city ordinances. But Todd's true sin? Using the HOA as his personal piggy bank. At first, I tried to reason with him. My fence was slightly off color because the approved stain wasn't available, and he fined me $500. I explained, provided receipts, and asked for leniency. Todd smirked and said, "Rules are rules," and walked away. That's when I decided I would take him down. Not with screaming or public arguments, but methodically, legally, and in a way he'd never recover from. Step 1. Become the inside man. Todd's first mistake was underestimating me. I volunteered for the HOA board under the guise of wanting to get involved in the community. I played the part of the eager, naive newbie perfectly. For 2 years, I attended every meeting, quietly observing how Todd operated. I learned how he controlled the board by bullying other members and burying them in paperwork. He'd push through votes when only his allies were present and conveniently lose paperwork submitted by dissenting homeowners. I kept my head down, took detailed notes, and waited. My goal was to outlast his term as president so I could begin making changes. Then I discovered Todd's second mistake. He wasn't just a bully, he was a thief. Step 2. Follow the money. Todd loved to brag about how he kept the HOA finances in order, but something didn't add up. The HOA fees were high, much higher than in similar neighborhoods, but the common areas were falling apart. The pool was closed half the summer due to maintenance issues, and the landscaping looked like it hadn't been touched in months. I started digging. As the HOA treasurer, Todd had access to all of the accounts, but he was notoriously cagey about sharing financial details. I asked for the budget during a meeting, and Todd laughed it off, saying, "Don't worry, I've got it under control." I filed a formal request for the financial records, which, under HOA rules, he was required to provide. Weeks went by with no response. That's when I started to talk with the neighbors. Turns out, I wasn't the only suspicious one. Over a dozen homeowners had requested access to the budget over the years, only to be ignored. One neighbor claimed Todd had used HOA funds to install a new patio at his house, while another swore he'd seen Todd's kids at the community pool during its maintenance closure. Armed with these suspicions, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, forcing Todd to provide the records. He stalled, but I wasn't backing down. Step 3. Build the case. When Todd finally handed over the financial records, they were a mess. Invoices were missing, payments were mislabeled, and some expenses were downright bizarre. A $15,000 landscaping fee paid to a company that didn't exist. Thousands spent on administrative costs with no explanation. I cross-referenced the HOA's bank statements with public records and found the smoking gun. Todd was funneling money to his personal accounts. Even better, I discovered Todd had been inflating contractor fees, pocketing the difference, and splitting the profits with his buddy, a shady contractor who handled most of the HOA's maintenance. I compiled everything into a detailed report, complete with spreadsheets, photos, and notarized statements from neighbors who had seen Todd's antics firsthand. Step 4. The coup. I waited for the annual HOA meeting, which was typically a snooze fest attended by only a handful of homeowners, but this time I made sure people showed up. I spent weeks knocking on doors, explaining what Todd had been up to. I didn't share everything, just enough to get people angry and curious. On the night of the meeting, the room was packed. Todd started the meeting like usual, droning on about how difficult it was to manage the HOA and how much he'd sacrificed for the community. That's when I stood up. I calmly asked if he could explain some of the discrepancies in the budget. Todd laughed nervously and said, "I don't think this is the time or place." I replied, "Actually, Todd, it's the perfect time." I handed out copies of my report to everyone in the room. The mood shifted instantly. People started reading, whispering, and then shouting. Todd tried to regain control, but it was too late. I called for a vote to remove him as president, and by the end of the night, Todd was out. Step 5, the final blow. After Todd was removed, we hired an independent auditor to go through the HOA finances. They confirmed everything. Todd had embezzled over $50,000, mismanaged tens of thousands of dollars more, and committed multiple counts of fraud. We reported him to the police and filed a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. Oh, but it didn't end there. Todd's shady contractor buddy was also exposed and banned from doing business in the county. Todd had to sell his house to pay restitution and legal fees. His name became a running joke in the neighborhood, and no one would touch him professionally. With Todd gone, we restructured the HOA to prevent another dictator from taking over. We implemented term limits, required multiple board members to approve financial decisions, and created an online portal so all homeowners could access budgets and meeting minutes. The aftermath. Every time I walk past Todd's old house, now owned by a lovely family, I smile. The pool is open, the landscaping is beautiful, and the HOA fees are lower than ever. Todd, meanwhile, moved to a neighboring town, where he reportedly tried to join another HOA board, only to be laughed out of the room when someone Googled his name. Justice wasn't just served, it was plated, garnished, and savored. OP, I absolutely love that worked out for you. I have read so many stories about corrupt HOA boards and Karens just finding their way on the board so they can harass their neighbors. It's really, really made me cynical toward HOAs, and honestly, I would never, ever move anywhere with an HOA. But I'm glad it worked out for you, and you've kind of made it into a good thing for your community, so kudos to you, OP. Our next post comes from Broad ADZ. Cheat on your wife with mine, I will burn your life to the ground. Way back in the early 2000s, I began to suspect that my wife was up to something. Our 2 kids were about 4 and 6, still young, but not so young that they couldn't tell you something about what happened in their day. They started talking a lot about staying with my wife's parents during the day, which wasn't really that strange in and of itself, but since they lived about 90 minutes away, doing so 2 or 3 times a week seemed a bit much. That was basically every day she wasn't working at her part-time job. When I asked her about it, of course, she denied it, but she was never a good liar. So I started tracking the mileage on her car, and sure enough, she was driving an extra 400 miles per week, so I knew something was going on. Then, one day, I sat down at the computer, and she had left a sticky note with her AOL password written on it next to the keyboard. I couldn't resist and logged in to read her emails and saw a few email exchanges between her and her college BFF, where they discussed how my wife was regularly having passionate hugging with one of her ex-boyfriends from high school. No mention of details about him other than my wife also talking crap about his wife, making fun of how she had gotten fat after having kids. Anyway, I printed out these email exchanges and I stashed them away. I still needed to know the details, so I called a friend who was a cop, and he suggested I call a guy he knew that had left the force to become a private investigator. His name was Ron. Ron was great. I paid his retainer and gave him the emails and what little I knew about my wife's activities, and he figured out everything she was doing. His report, detailed with photos and times, dates, locations, had everything about how she would take the kids to her parents, then go meet this guy for lunch. Then they'd go to a dumpy motel for a few hours, after which she'd pick up the kids and return home. At this point, I hired a divorce lawyer. My parents had cheated on each other, and the fallout absolutely screwed mine and my siblings' childhood. This was something that was totally unacceptable. I also asked Ron to find out what he could about this guy. Ron absolutely came through. I learned his name, Bob, that he was married and had 3 kids. I also found out that he worked as a VP of sales for his father-in-law's business. At this point, I had my lawyer draw up the actual divorce papers. I also asked Ron for a couple more copies of his report and one more thing I wanted him to do for me. On the same day I had my wife served with the divorce papers at her work, I had Ron meet with this guy's wife and show her everything that he'd found out. She seemed nice, and I figured that she deserved to know what her dear hubby was up to. What she did with that information was up to her. While the information about my wife's infidelity didn't really matter in my divorce proceedings, Bob's wife did a real number on him. According to the publicly available court documents from the divorce and other related proceedings, she cleaned out their joint bank accounts and took the kids and left. As soon as her dad found out what he had done, Bob was fired, and since her parents actually owned the house where Bob and his wife lived, he also got evicted. Their divorce was ugly. Lots of fighting in and evidently out of court. I guess Bob went to the house and started arguing with his wife, and it escalated to the point where her brother stepped in and Bob got his nose broken. There were restraining orders and a few more incidents with police reports, criminal charges, and jail time, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, I can't find Bob on the internet anywhere these days. Last I heard, he'd left the state, and his ex-wife, she did okay. She went on to work at her dad's company and eventually took it over after he retired. As for me, my ex and I got along well enough. I didn't engage with her on anything that wasn't related to the kids, and now that they're both adults, I don't talk to her at all anymore. I don't hate her or anything, but I only care for her in the context that she's my kids' mom and is important to them, but nothing beyond that. OP, I applaud you. You did the right thing by letting that marriage go. A lot of people will blame themselves and make excuses for their partners and keep that marriage going, but you did the right thing. And that was a really nice thing of you to do, to give the wife of Bob a copy of that report. You saved her a whole lot of heartache down the road, so kudos to you. That was r/Prorevenge from Reddit After Hours. If you like this video, please like and subscribe and leave a comment to enter our $250 Amazon gift card giveaway at the end of the month.